They don't know I'm making this recording. If they did, well, let's just say the quiet life they assigned to me would get significantly quieter. Permanently. My name, the one on my driver's license, the one the mailman knows, it isn't real. The life I'm living is a carefully constructed fiction, a reward for my silence. But the thing I saw, the thing I heard in that concrete box under the Montana prairie, that was the most real thing I have ever known. I see a therapist once a week, a company man with kind eyes and a deep understanding of state-sanctioned trauma. We talk about my disassociation, my lingering operational stress. We never talk about the numbers, but I can feel them, even now, 30 years later. The pattern is starting again. I see it in the static of the markets, in the chaotic chatter of the web, in the strange rhythmic failures of power grids. It's a faint echo of the song it sang then. The silence has lasted long enough. Someone else needs to know the truth before it's buried for good. Buried like that body was. Before they called me, I was a man who believed in systems, in logic. I believed that every puzzle had an answer. You just had to find the right key. But the truth is, some locks aren't meant to be opened. And some keys are screaming to be heard. It all started in the fall of 1991. It was a Tuesday. I remember that, with perfect clarity. A Tuesday in October, the kind of day in Langley, Virginia, where the air is crisp and carries the smell of decaying leaves. A pleasant sort of melancholy. I was in my office on the 4th floor of the old headquarters building, a place that felt more like a university library than the nerve center of global espionage. My world was one of quiet contemplation. It was a world of algorithms, of prime number theory, of the delicate, beautiful mathematics of concealment. I wasn't a spy. I didn't carry a weapon or meet contacts in foggy European capitals. I was a cryptographer, a code breaker. My job was to turn noise into meaning, to find the ghost of order in the machine of chaos. That day, I was working on a particularly stubborn block of encrypted traffic from a Libyan listening post, a puzzle that was resisting my efforts with an almost personal animosity. The coffee was stale. The hum of the IBM mainframe down the hall was a familiar lullaby, and the world outside my window felt a million miles away. My world was the glowing green text on my monitor, a silent war of symbols. The phone rang at precisely 1400 hours. It was the red phone, the one that bypassed my secretary, the one that meant a conversation I would not be logging. I picked it up. "Thorne," I said, my eyes still on the screen. The voice on the other end was flat, devoid of warmth or personality. It was a voice I knew well. Agent Coulson. A man who moved through the agency like a shark through water, all cold efficiency and unseen menace. He wasn't a man for pleasantries. "Dr. Thorne, a car will be waiting for you at the main entrance in 15 minutes. Pack a bag for 72 hours. Bring your kit." My kit wasn't a set of lockpicks or a silenced pistol. It was a heavy briefcase containing a custom-built portable decryption unit, a set of specialized headphones, and notebooks filled with my own personal ciphers and logarithmic tables. "Where are we going, Coulson?" I asked, already starting to close down my terminal. There was a pause. With Coulson, a pause was never just a pause. It was a calculated instrument. "Baltimore," he said, and the way he said it, the word sounded alien, like a code name for some forgotten Cold War outpost. "There's a situation at the city morgue. The director himself has taken an interest." The director? My fingers froze over the keyboard. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency does not take a personal interest in the Baltimore City morgue, not unless someone had died there who shouldn't have. Or, as I was about to find out, not unless something had arrived there that shouldn't even exist. I didn't ask any more questions. You didn't, with men like Coulson. You just packed your bag and went. 15 minutes later, I was in the back of a black government sedan, the kind with tinted windows that make the world outside look perpetually overcast. Coulson sat beside me, staring straight ahead, a statue carved from secrets and institutional authority. He didn't speak for the first 20 minutes of the drive. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken protocols and clearances I didn't have. I finally broke it. A morgue, Coulson? This is a long way from Tripoli. He turned his head slowly, his eyes like chips of flint. This isn't about Tripoli, Doctor. This is domestic. And it's anomalous. Anomalous. In agency parlance, that word was a universe of meaning. It could mean anything from a double agent acting unpredictably to a satellite falling out of orbit. But the weight he put on it felt different. He passed me a thin manila folder. It contained a single sheet of paper, a preliminary report from the Baltimore Police Department. It was a John Doe case. A man, middle-aged, found in a cheap motel room off the interstate. No signs of struggle, no identification, no obvious cause of death. It was the kind of sad, anonymous end that happens 100 times a day in a country of 300 million people. Nothing about it warranted a call from the director. Nothing on that page. I handed it back to him. I still don't see the agency's interest, Coulson. He took the folder and placed it neatly back in his briefcase. That's because the interest isn't on the paper, he said, his gaze returning to the road ahead. The interest started about 3 hours ago, on the autopsy table. He let the sentence hang in the air. Dr. Corbin, the medical examiner, was beginning the initial incision, standard procedure. And then the John Doe sat up. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. His face was a mask of grim sincerity. It sat up, Coulson repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And it began to speak. That's why we're going, Doctor. That's why you're here. We need you to tell us what it's saying. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. A dead man talking was a story for a cheap horror novel, not a Tuesday afternoon briefing. What is it saying? I asked, my own voice sounding thin. Coulson finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond professional detachment in his eyes. A sliver of genuine, profound unease. That's the problem, Doctor, he said. It's not speaking words. It's just numbers. An endless, monotonous stream of numbers. And it hasn't stopped once. The Baltimore City morgue was a brutalist block of concrete and grime, a building that seemed to absorb the grayness of the sky. It smelled of bleach and a deeper, sweeter odor of decay that clung to the back of the throat. The place had been cleared out. 2 stoic men in dark suits, clearly Coulson's people, stood by the entrance. They didn't look at us as we passed. They looked through us, their eyes scanning the empty street, watching for threats that weren't there. We were led down a series of sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways, the silence broken only by the rhythmic squeak of my own shoes on the linoleum. The air grew colder with every step, a damp, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. We stopped at a heavy, stainless steel door. Coulson placed a hand on it, pausing for a moment. Inside, he said, his voice low, is Dr. Miles Corbin, the M.E., and the subject. Corbin is distressed. Try to be professional. Don't react. Just listen. I nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was a man of patterns, of predictable systems. Nothing in my life had prepared me for this. Nothing in the logical, ordered world of cryptography could account for a talking corpse. Coulson pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The autopsy suite was a study in cold, hard surfaces, stainless steel tables, white-tiled walls, and the blinding glare of overhead surgical lights. The room was dominated by the central table. On it, under a thin white sheet, was the outline of a human body. But it wasn't lying down. It was propped up from the waist, resting on its elbows, in a grotesque parody of a patient relaxing in a hospital bed. A man in green scrubs stood huddled in the corner of the room, as far from the table as he could get. He was trembling, his face pale and slick with sweat. This had to be Dr. Corbin. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have scoured all other emotions from his face. But it wasn't the sight of the sitting corpse or the terrified medical examiner that hit me first. It was the sound. It was a voice, technically. A human voice, male, a monotone baritone. But it was utterly devoid of inflection, of rhythm, of life. It was a continuous, seamless stream of sound, a verbal ticker tape, and it was just as Coulson had described. Numbers: 7, 4, 1, 1, 0, 8, 9, 2, 6, 3, 3, 5, 7, 1, 8, 0, 4, 9. It didn't pause for breath. It didn't change pitch. It just flowed. The sound filled the small room, a droning, hypnotic litany that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. It was the most unsettling sound I had ever heard. I took a step closer to the table. Coulson put a restraining hand on my arm. "Careful, Doctor." I ignored him. My professional curiosity, my lifelong obsession with patterns, was overriding my fear. I needed to see it. I reached the side of the table and looked. The man, or what had been a man, was unremarkable. Maybe 50 years old, with thinning gray hair and the soft, nondescript features of someone who had lived a life of quiet desperation. His skin had the waxy, grayish pallor of death. His eyes were closed, the lids slightly sunken. His chest was still. There was no rise and fall, no indication of respiration. But his lips moved. They formed the shapes of the numbers with a detached mechanical precision. His jaw worked, his tongue articulated, but the rest of him was utterly, profoundly still. It was like watching a ventriloquist's dummy, but the voice was coming from its own throat. "Dr. Corbin," Coulson said, his voice sharp, cutting through the droning numbers. Corbin flinched, as if waking from a nightmare. "Tell Dr. Thorne what you found. Or rather, what you didn't find." Corbin swallowed hard, his eyes darting towards the body and then quickly away. No vital signs," he stammered, his voice cracking. "None. I've had him hooked up to every monitor we have. The EKG is flatline. Has been since he arrived. No heartbeat. No electrical activity in the brain on the EEG. Temperature is 68.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Ambient room temperature? Lividity and rigor are consistent with a time of death approximately 10 to 12 hours ago. By every medical definition, every single one, this man is dead. He's a corpse." He wiped a hand across his sweaty brow. "But he's been doing that for 3 hours and 17 minutes, ever since I made the first cut." He pointed a trembling finger to a thin, dark line of a partial incision on the corpse's chest. "It's impossible. It violates every law of biology, of physics." I pulled a small stool over and sat down next to the table. I took out a notebook and a pen from my briefcase. The professional in me was taking over, a blessed relief from the primal fear. This was just another form of encrypted traffic. Strange, yes. Unprecedented, certainly. But it was a pattern, and any pattern could be broken. "Just keep talking," I murmured to the dead man. "Don't stop." I started to write, my pen flying across the page, trying to capture the stream. 2, 5, 5, 9, 0, 1, 3, 7, 4, 8, 6, 6, 2, 0. It was a random string. No obvious repetition, no simple sequence. It was a jumble of digits, meaningless and chaotic. For nearly an hour I sat there, filling page after page with numbers. The monotone drone became the entire world. The cold of the room, Coulson's silent presence, Corbin's quiet hyperventilating in the corner. It all faded away. There was only me, the pen, and the endless voice of the dead man. And then I felt a familiar tingle, the ghost of a whisper in the back of my mind, the cryptographer's instinct. The numbers weren't entirely random. There was a structure to them, a length. The strings were being delivered in blocks. I started marking the pauses, the almost imperceptible shifts in rhythm that my trained ear was beginning to detect. They were blocks of 5 digits, a 5-digit intercept, a common military format. But that wasn't enough. It was still gibberish. I leaned back, frustrated, staring at the pages of nonsensical data. My gaze fell on my briefcase, my kit, my portable decryption unit. It was designed to run complex algorithms against known cipher systems. It was a long shot, a shot in the deepest, darkest part of the universe, but it was the only shot I had. "Coulson," I said, not taking my eyes off the corpse, "I need a secure power source, and I need you to get me the latest KGB codebooks, specifically the one-time pad authentication keys for their highest level GRU communications, the Zodiac series." Coulson stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. The Zodiac keys? Thorne. Those are some of the most heavily guarded secrets in this building. I can't just... "Can't you?" I interrupted, my voice sharp. "The director is interested. You said so yourself. This thing is broadcasting in a structured format. I have a hunch, a wild, insane hunch. But if I'm right, if I am even close to being right, then this is a national security crisis the likes of which we have never seen. Get me the keys." Coulson held my gaze for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. He left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. For the next 2 hours, I sat in the chilling silence broken only by the dead man's numerical sermon. I set up my machine, calibrating it, feeding into it the raw data I had transcribed. I felt like a priest performing a bizarre technological exorcism. Finally, a young, nervous-looking agent arrived with a locked briefcase. He handed it to Coulson, who had returned, and then left without a word. Coulson opened the case and handed me a small, heavy book bound in black leather. It had no title. Inside were pages and pages of 5-digit codes, the keys to unlocking the deepest secrets of our greatest enemy. I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. I chose a recent block of numbers the corpse had spoken, a string of 30 digits. I typed them into my machine. Then I found the corresponding date and time in the KGB codebook and entered the one-time pad key. I initiated the decryption algorithm. The machine hummed for a few seconds. A lifetime. Then a single line of plain text appeared on its small green screen. My blood ran cold. I felt the air leave my lungs. A silent gasp. I stood up, my legs suddenly weak, and stared at the screen, reading the words over and over again. It was impossible. Utterly, horrifyingly impossible. Coulson stepped forward. "What is it, Doctor? What does it say?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed a trembling finger at the screen. He leaned in to read it. His face, for the first time since I'd met him, lost its composure. The mask of professional calm shattered, replaced by a look of stark, undiluted horror. The text on the screen was a simple, declarative sentence. A sentence that had been transmitted less than 5 minutes ago from a deeply embedded CIA asset in Moscow to his handler in Langley. A sentence that only 3 people on the planet were supposed to have seen. It read, "KGB Colonel Sergei Orlov will defect at checkpoint Charlie tomorrow at 600 packages secure." This dead man, this John Doe in a Baltimore morgue, was not just speaking numbers. He was broadcasting, in real time, the most secure, most secret, Most valuable intelligence the Soviet Union possessed. He was a key. No, he was more than a key. He was a ghost in their machine. And our machine too. He was a biological one-time pad, an oracle of secrets. And we had absolutely no idea where he came from. The 24 hours that followed were a blur of controlled, high-level panic. The Baltimore City morgue was no longer a morgue. It was a black site, a sealed environment. Within an hour of my discovery, a team from the agency's Special Activities Division descended on the place. They moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency. They weren't spooks like Coulson. They were operators. Hard men with empty eyes and the kind of quiet competence that comes from doing terrible things in forgotten places. They evacuated the building, citing a chemical spill, a cover story that was flimsy but brutally enforced. The local police, including the ones who had found the body, were debriefed, sworn to a level of secrecy that was backed by career-ending threats, and sent on their way with the dawning, fearful realization that they had stumbled into a world far above their pay grade. Poor Dr. Corbin was sedated and quietly transported to a medical facility in Virginia, from which I knew he would likely never practice medicine again. He knew too much. He had seen the impossible. In the modern world, that was a communicable disease, and the agency was the only cure. I remained, along with Coulson, and a newly arrived two-man technical team. Our world shrank to the confines of that single cold autopsy suite. The object on the table, we had started calling it the object, because calling it him felt both inaccurate and obscene, continued its broadcast. The monotonous stream of numbers became the soundtrack to our new reality. My initial chilling discovery was just the beginning, the tip of an iceberg of pure, unadulterated impossibility. For the next 12 hours, I worked in a state of feverish, terrified focus. I would feed the object's numerical broadcasts into my machine, and it would spit out secrets, not just KGB secrets. At around 0300 in the morning, the rhythm of its speech shifted slightly. The 5-digit blocks changed to 7-digit blocks. On another hunch, I requested the key tables for the Chinese Ministry of State Security. The result was instantaneous. We were suddenly reading the encrypted communications between their embassy in Washington and Beijing. We saw the details of their attempts to acquire sensitive stealth technology. We saw their confidential assessments of the president's health. The object was a universal key, a skeleton key for the locked doors of global espionage. It was a Rosetta Stone for the language of secrets. The implications were staggering, world-altering. The power to have real-time, perfect access to the classified communications of every major world power. It was the holy grail of intelligence, a strategic advantage so absolute it could rewrite the geopolitical map overnight. But with that dawning realization came a deeper, more profound terror. Where did this information come from? How could this thing, a dead man with no brain activity, possess it? It wasn't hacking a signal. It wasn't intercepting a radio wave. The data it was outputting was protected by one-time pads, the only theoretically unbreakable form of encryption. The only way to decode a one-time pad message is to have the key, and the object was the key. It was generating them. Perfectly. In real time. It knew the keys before they were even used. This wasn't a feat of technology. It was a violation of the fundamental laws of information, of causality itself. At dawn, Coulson made the call. The object was too valuable and too dangerous to remain in a civilian facility, no matter how secure. It had to be moved. It had to be taken to a place designed to hold things that didn't belong in our world. It had to go into the dark. The destination was a place I'd only ever heard of in whispers, in hushed, paranoid conversations over late-night drinks with other lifers in the agency. It didn't have a name, just a designation. Site Proserpina. A deep underground facility, somewhere in the vast, empty expanse of Montana. Officially a decommissioned Cold War-era atmospheric research station. Unofficially, it was one of the agency's ice boxes, a place where they put anomalies they couldn't explain or destroy. The logistics of the move were executed with military precision. A black, windowless transport vehicle, the kind used for moving nuclear materials, arrived at the morgue's loading bay. The object, still sitting up, still murmuring its endless stream of numbers, was carefully secured to a gurney. They didn't put it in a body bag. They strapped it down as if it were a live, volatile prisoner. As they wheeled it out of the autopsy suite, its voice echoing in the tiled hallway, I felt a wave of primitive, superstitious dread wash over me. We were not transporting a body. We were moving a cursed artifact. The flight to Montana was on a sterile, unmarked C-130 transport plane. The entire cargo bay had been converted into a mobile containment unit. The object was there, strapped down in the center of the hold, its voice a low, constant drone beneath the roar of the engines. I sat with Coulson and the tech team, watching it. The lead technician, a young, brilliant, but deeply unnerving man named Jennings, had hooked it up to a new suite of monitors. The readouts were the same. Flatline, no heartbeat, no respiration, no brain activity on the EEG. He ran a fiber optic scope down its throat. "It's clean, sir," he reported to Coulson, his voice tinny over the intercom. "The vocal cords are moving. They are vibrating to produce the sound. But there's no airflow, no exhalation. They're moving on their own, like the strings of a violin being played by an invisible bow. They were not dealing with a reanimated person. We were not dealing with a biological life form in any sense that we understood. We were in the presence of a machine, a biological broadcasting device of unknown origin and unimaginable purpose. Its human form was just a chassis, an antenna made of flesh and bone. We landed at a desolate, wind-swept airstrip in the middle of nowhere. The sky was a vast, empty blue canvas. The air was thin and cold. Site Proserpina was not visible from the air. The entrance was a simple concrete blockhouse, the kind of drab, functional structure that dots military bases across the country. But a massive, reinforced blast door slid open, revealing a ramp that descended deep into the earth. The truck carrying the object drove down into the darkness, and we followed in a separate vehicle. The facility was a masterpiece of Cold War paranoia, a self-contained world buried hundreds of feet beneath the prairie. The corridors were stark white, the air was filtered and tasted sterile, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the life support systems. The object was taken to a central containment cell, a glass-walled room, shielded against electromagnetic interference, with its own independent power and air supply. It was a cage designed to hold something that could manipulate the world outside. They placed the gurney in the center of the room, and we watched from the adjoining observation deck, separated by 3 inches of transparent, bulletproof polymer. The object continued its broadcast, the numbers now echoing in the sterile silence of its new prison. It was at this point that its broadcast changed again. It stopped broadcasting keys for China. The rhythm shifted. The blocks of numbers changed length. I scrambled to find a match. Israel's Mossad, then Britain's MI6, then the French DGSE. It was cycling through the great powers, one by one, laying their most guarded secrets bare in a monotonous dead voice. It was a performance, a demonstration of its power. And we were the terrified, captive audience. The team had been escalated. A biologist was flown in, a physicist specializing in quantum information theory. We were a hastily assembled team of the best and brightest, brought together to study God, or whatever it was, in a glass box. But as the hours ticked by, a new, more terrifying thought began to take root in my mind. This thing did not show any signs of life. It didn't need to eat or drink or breathe. It had no discernible power source. So, What was keeping it going? And more importantly, for how long? We were frantically trying to understand it, to exploit it, to contain it. But maybe we were asking the wrong questions. Maybe we weren't meant to understand it at all. Maybe we were just meant to listen. And maybe, just maybe, the broadcast wasn't meant for us. The 72nd hour was the breaking point. For 3 solid days, Object Oracle, as it was now officially designated in the project files, had been the center of our universe. It sat in its glass cage, an impassive, dead oracle, speaking a language of pure, unadulterated truth. We had filled entire server banks with its transmissions. We had a real-time, perfect window into the secret heart of the world. We were drowning in data, in a flood of intelligence so vast and so sensitive that the very possession of it was a threat. The director and a handful of his deputies at Langley were in a state of controlled ecstasy, seeing the dawn of a new era of American dominance. But for us, the ones in the room, the ones who had to watch the dead thing speak, the feeling was not one of triumph. It was one of deep, soul-crushing dread. The Oracle felt wrong. Its very existence was a crack in the foundation of reality, and we were the ones staring into the abyss. The physicist, a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, was convinced it was a quantum phenomenon. It's not predicting the one-time pads, she argued, her voice strained after 2 sleepless nights. It's entangled with the systems that generate them. Somehow, this biological substrate is acting as a receiving station for quantum information that is collapsing into a determined state simultaneously here and in, say, a GRU bunker under Moscow. It shouldn't be possible. It defies the no communication theorem, but it's happening. The biologist, Dr. Bell, was focused on the physical body. He'd taken microscopic tissue samples. The results only deepened the mystery. The cellular decay has been completely arrested, he explained, pointing at a series of electron microscope images on a monitor. There's no necrosis, no bacterial action. The cells are inert. They are like a snapshot, a perfect recording of the state of a body at the moment of death. But the cells in the larynx, the vocal cords, they're different. They're cycling energy from an unknown source. There's a low-level isotopic decay present that matches no known element. It's not burning fuel. It's resonating. I didn't care about the how. I cared about the what and the why. I was a cryptographer, a linguist of secrets, and this thing was speaking the most profound language I had ever encountered. But I had a growing, gnawing feeling that we were missing the point. We were so focused on the content of the broadcast, the intelligence, the secrets, that we weren't listening to the music, the rhythm, the cadence, the slow, deliberate cycling through the world's powers. It didn't feel like a random data stream. It felt like a calibration, a test pattern. It was introducing itself. It was showing us what it could do. And that led to the most terrifying question of all. A calibration for what? What was the main event? On the 3rd day, at precisely 1400 hours, 72 hours and 17 minutes after Dr. Corbin had made his first incision, it happened. The broadcast changed one last time. It had just finished a long run of keys for the Israeli Mossad. There was a pause. Not the micro pause between number blocks, but a full, profound silence that lasted for exactly 3 seconds. The silence was so sudden, so absolute, that it was more shocking than the sound had been. We all froze. Every person in the observation room held their breath. Then it started speaking again. But the voice was different. The monotone was still there, but the rhythm was gone. The neat, structured blocks of numbers were gone. It was now a seamless, chaotic, and impossibly fast stream of digits. 976311. 400 out, wow, 8, 5. It was a blur of sound, too fast for me to even transcribe. We had to rely on the high-speed recorders. I ran the new data through every decryption algorithm I had. I tried to match it against every known cryptographic system on the planet, military or civilian. Nothing. It was pure, random noise. It did not match any one-time pad. It did not conform to any mathematical model of a cipher. It was a language we did not know, from a place we could not imagine. It was the purest form of chaos I had ever witnessed. It was the sound of static, the sound of the universe without a signal. It continued this chaotic, high-speed broadcast for exactly 1 hour, 60 minutes of meaningless, terrifying noise. And then, at 1500 hours, it stopped. The last number echoed in the silent, sterile room. And then, nothing. The object fell silent. It remained sitting up for a few moments, a silent, dead puppet. And then, it slumped forward. It collapsed onto the gurney, its head hitting the metal with a soft, dull thud. For the first time in 3 days, it was just a body again. A dead man lying on a table. The silence was deafening. We stared, waiting for it to sit up again, waiting for the numbers to start. But there was only the hum of the air conditioners. An hour passed. An hour of the most intense, nerve-shredding silence I've ever experienced. Coulson was on the phone with Langley, his voice a low, tense murmur. Doctor. Sharma was scribbling frantic equations on a whiteboard. Dr. Bell was staring at his monitors, his face ashen. And then it began. It started at the fingertips. A small patch of skin on the object's right hand turned a dull, matte gray. Then it just dissolved. It flaked away, not into skin cells or dust, but into something finer, an impalpable, almost ethereal gray powder. The process accelerated with horrifying speed. The grayness spread up the arm like a fast-moving stain, the flesh beneath it simply ceasing to exist, collapsing into this fine, uniform dust. It was not decomposition. It was not burning. It was a process of absolute, total dissolution. It was like watching a film run in reverse, but instead of coming together, it was coming apart. Every molecule unmaking itself. Within minutes, the entire body was gone. All that remained on the gurney was a neat, vaguely human-shaped pile of fine gray dust and a few of the more resilient materials from the man's clothes. A metal belt buckle, the zipper from his trousers. There was no smell, no heat, no residue other than the powder. The oracle was gone. It had delivered its message, and then it had erased itself from existence. The aftermath was swift and chilling. The incident was buried so deep it never happened. Project Oracle was terminated. All data was either classified at a level so high only the director could access it, or it was destroyed. All personnel, myself included, were subjected to a week of intense debriefings. We were signing non-disclosure agreements that were, in essence, contracts for our entire lives. We were told, in no uncertain terms, that what we saw in Site Proserpina was a collective, stress-induced hallucination. A fiction. We were given new assignments, new lives. We were scattered to the wind, a secret shared between a handful of people who were forbidden from ever speaking to each other again. The official record states that an unidentified John Doe died of a heart attack in a Baltimore motel and was cremated as per standard procedure for unclaimed bodies. There is no record of Dr. Corbin's breakdown. There is no record of the C-130 flight to Montana. There is no record of Site Proserpina ever housing anything other than weather balloons. The mystery was not solved. It was erased. But I have the final recording. I made a copy of that last hour of chaotic broadcast. A single reel of magnetic tape that I have kept hidden for 30 years. That final, terrifying string of numbers that was never decoded. Sometimes late at night, I pull it out. I don't try to break it anymore. I know that's impossible. I just listen. I listen to the sound of pure chaos, a message from nowhere. And I wonder, was it a final warning? Was it a distress call? Or was it something far, far worse? Was it a sign-off? Was the oracle just the messenger telling its silent, distant masters that the calibration was complete, the channel was open, and the audience was listening? The mystery isn't that the corpse spoke. The mystery is what happens now that it's silent, because the silence it left behind is more terrifying than any number it ever spoke. 30 years. For 30 years, I have lived in the shadow of that silence. The agency gave me a quiet retirement, a generous pension, a new identity in a sleepy town in Oregon where the rain washes the streets clean and no one asks too many questions. They called it a reward for a lifetime of service. But I knew what it was. It was a gilded cage, a comfortable prison where my only warden was my own memory. For the first decade, I tried to obey. I tried to forget. I took up gardening. I learned to fly fish. I filled my days with the mundane, with the beautifully predictable patterns of a civilian life. I told myself the story they had written for me. It was a shared hallucination, a psychological break brought on by the immense stress of Cold War intelligence work. The mind is a fragile thing, I would tell myself. It can play tricks. But at night, in the deep, dark hours before the dawn, the numbers would come back. Not as a memory, but as a feeling. A low hum in the back of my mind. The echo of that final, chaotic broadcast. The undeciphered message. It was the tape that broke my compliance. That single reel of magnetic tape I had copied in the final, panicked hours at Site Proserpina. It was an act of pure, suicidal defiance. While the official logs were being wiped, I had routed the final hour's recording to a secondary forgotten archive machine in a sub-basement of the facility. I retrieved the reel just before we were evacuated, a small, heavy circle of plastic and secrets that I hid in the false bottom of my decryption kit. For years, I kept it locked away. It was a toxic artifact, a relic of a life I was supposed to have forgotten. To listen to it felt like a betrayal, a violation of the pact of silence that was keeping me alive. But the silence stretched and the questions festered. The world changed. The Soviet Union was a memory. The digital age dawned. The old secrets were replaced by new ones. And yet, the feeling persisted. The feeling that the story wasn't over. That the oracle's silence was not an ending, but a pause. About 15 years ago, I started my real work. The investigation. Not the official one that was shut down before it began, but my own. A secret project conducted in the basement of my quiet suburban home. My basement became my new Langley. I soundproofed the walls. I bought old, decommissioned SIGINT equipment from military surplus auctions, paying cash through a series of shell corporations I set up. I rebuilt a listening post. My target was not a foreign power. It was the past. I started by trying to find the others. Coulson had vanished, of course. Men like him don't retire. They just become ghosts with different names. Dr. Bell, the biologist I found, had died in a car accident just 6 months after the Proserpina incident. A single vehicle crash on a clear, dry night. No witnesses. Dr. Sharma, the physicist, had a more public and perhaps more tragic end. She became a pariah in her field. She abandoned quantum information theory and began publishing bizarre, rambling papers on esoteric cosmology and signal theory, full of paranoid ramblings about sentient information and acausal broadcasts. Her university revoked her tenure. She died in a private psychiatric hospital in upstate New York, dismissed by her peers as a brilliant mind that had simply snapped. They were all gone, silenced by accident or by design. I was the last one left, the last one who remembered. So I turned my investigation from the people to the data, to the tape. For years, I did what I did best. I attacked it with mathematics. I ran the chaotic stream of numbers against every algorithm I could devise. I spent thousands of hours searching for a key, for a pattern, for any hint of linguistic structure. I used prime number sieves, Fourier analysis, fractal geometry. Nothing. The data resisted every attempt at decryption. It was, by every mathematical measure, perfect noise, statistically indistinguishable from true randomness. And that, in itself, was the most terrifying clue of all. True, perfect randomness is almost impossible to generate. Even the most complex computer algorithms have hidden biases, subtle patterns that can be detected. But the Oracle's final message was flawless. It was the kind of randomness that shouldn't exist in a deterministic universe. It was the signature of something from outside the system. Frustrated, I abandoned the direct assault and turned to a new line of inquiry: the origin of the object itself, the John Doe. The official story was a lie, I knew that. But lies are built on a foundation of truth. Somewhere, a man had disappeared. I became a different kind of analyst. I spent years scouring missing persons databases, cold cases from the late 80s and early 90s. I was looking for a man matching the object's description. Male, Caucasian, late 40s or early 50s, no distinguishing marks. It was a search for a needle in a continent-sized haystack. I cross-referenced dental records, medical histories, anything I could pull from the burgeoning internet of the late 90s and early 2000s. For years, it was a dead end. Thousands of missing men, thousands of heartbroken families, but no match. And then, I found him. It wasn't in an American database. It was in a dusty, half-forgotten archive of the Stasi, the East German secret police, which had been declassified and dumped online after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The file was on a man named Elias Vance. My blood ran cold when I saw the name. Elias Vance. He had been my mentor at the agency back in the early 80s. He was the most brilliant cryptographer I had ever known, a genius who could see the music and the numbers like no one else. But he was also unstable. He grew obsessed with so-called numbers stations, the mysterious shortwave radio stations that broadcast endless streams of spoken numbers, believed to be messages for undercover agents. He claimed to have found a pattern in them, a meta-language that wasn't for spies, but for something else. He started talking about signals from empty space, about a conversation the universe was having with itself. The agency, fearing he was a security risk, pushed him out. He had a breakdown, a full, psychotic episode. He disappeared in 1988. The official story was that he had taken his own life. But the Stasi file told a different story. They had been tracking him. They believed his theories weren't madness, but a breakthrough. They believed he was on the verge of intercepting a new form of American intelligence broadcast. The file contained a grainy surveillance photograph of Elias, taken in West Berlin in 1989. He looked older, gaunt, his eyes filled with a wild, hunted look. But it was him. And then I saw the date of the final entry in the Stasi file, October 1991. The file stated that their asset tracking Vance had reported he had achieved his goal and was attempting to become the receiver. Then the trail went cold. He had vanished from Berlin just days before our John Doe appeared in that Baltimore motel. I pulled up the old autopsy photos from the Proserpina file, the ones I had secretly digitized and stored on an encrypted hard drive. I put the Stasi surveillance photo next to the image of the dead man on the autopsy table. The years had been hard on him, but the facial structure, the hairline, the shape of the ears, it was a match. It was a perfect match. The John Doe, the object, the oracle. It was Elias Vance, my mentor. The man who had been driven mad by listening to numbers had, somehow, become the numbers themselves, and I realized my investigation had been backwards all this time. The secret wasn't in the final chaotic message. The final message was the only thing that wasn't for us. The real message, the one he intended for me, for the agency, was everything that came before it. He had hijacked the most secure channels in the world to prove he was right. He was ringing the dinner bell, not for a predator, but for us. He was showing us the key. And the final chaotic broadcast? That was the sound of him being consumed by whatever it was he had found. That was the sound of the door he had opened, closing behind him forever. The revelation that the Oracle was Elias Vance didn't solve the mystery. It fractured it into 1,000 more terrifying pieces. My quiet basement, once a sanctuary of logical inquiry, now felt like a tomb, haunted by the ghost of my former mentor. I had spent years treating the Oracle as an alien artifact, a piece of otherworldly technology that had fallen into our laps. But now, I had to confront a more intimate and disturbing truth. This was a human tragedy. It was the final, desperate act of a man I once knew. A man I had dismissed as a paranoid lunatic. My guilt, long buried under a mountain of professional arrogance, came rushing back. I remembered my last conversation with Elias, in a sterile briefing room at Langley. He had tried to explain his theories to me, his hands trembling as he pointed to charts of signal propagation and prime number distribution. He spoke of a syntactic structure, hidden beneath the random noise of the number stations, a signal that wasn't just encrypted, but was layered within the very fabric of mathematical chance. He called it the prime harmonic. I had patronized him. I told him he needed rest, that he was seeing patterns where there were none, the classic symptom of a brilliant mind starting to fray. "You're wrong, Aris," he had whispered, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "It's not a message in the static. The static is the message. It's a language, and I'm learning how to speak it." He was right. He had been right all along. And in my pride, in my rigid adherence to the known rules of my craft, I had failed to listen. This new, horrifying context forced me to re-examine everything. I pulled out my old notes from Site Proserpina, the frantic scribbles I had made during those 72 hours. I looked past the decoded intelligence, the KGB and Mossad secrets, and focused on the carrier signal itself. The voice. The dead, monotone voice of Elias Vance. I ran a spectral analysis on the audio recording of the broadcast, something we had neglected to do in our rush to decrypt the content. The results were chilling. Beneath the audible frequencies of his voice buried deep in the subsonic range, there was another signal. A faint, rhythmic pulse. It was incredibly complex, a layered pattern of low-frequency vibrations. It wasn't a byproduct of the recording equipment. It was embedded in the sound itself. It was the prime harmonic Elias had described, the background radiation of his cosmic conversation. He hadn't just been speaking the numbers, he had been transmitting on a second hidden channel, a channel our ears couldn't hear, but our machines could barely detect. I spent the next year of my life dedicated to this one task, decoding the subsonic pulse. It was a cipher of unbelievable complexity. It wasn't based on language or mathematics as I knew them. It was based on ratios, on the relationships between the frequencies themselves. It was a language of pure form. It was like trying to translate the song of a whale or the pattern of a quasar. I had to unlearn a lifetime of cryptographic training and approach it not as a codebreaker, but as a musician, as a physicist. I built new algorithms based on harmonic resonance and wave interference patterns. I let my machines run for weeks at a time, searching for a single, repeatable phrase in the low-frequency drone. And then, one rainy Tuesday morning, the computer chimed. It had found a match, a recurring sequence, a single word in the language of the harmonic. I cross-referenced the timestamp of the sequence with my logs from 1991. The word had been broadcast at the exact moment the Oracle had switched from broadcasting KGB keys to Chinese MSS keys. It was a marker, a tag in the data. With this single word as my key, my Rosetta Stone, I began to unlock the rest. It was a slow, agonizing process. It took me another 2 years. The subsonic message wasn't a narrative. It was a log file, a technical readout. It was Elias's own notes, broadcast from beyond the grave. I sat in my basement, the hum of the servers my only companion, and I read the ghost's journal. The transcriptions that spooled out of my printer were the most terrifying documents I had ever seen. The frequency is a key. One of the first translated entries read, "Not for a lock, for a membrane. The body is an antenna. The resonant frequency must be precise. Had to attune the cellular structure. The decay had to be halted at the quantum level, a stasis field generated by the signal itself." He was describing, in cold, clinical detail, how he had transformed himself into the object. He had used a combination of biofeedback, self-hypnosis, and a low-wattage radio transmitter tuned to a specific, calculated frequency to alter his own body, to turn himself from a man into a receiver. He had found a way to make his own cellular matrix resonate with the prime harmonic. The logs grew more disturbing. He described the other side. He didn't call it a place, he called it a domain of pure information. A reality where thought and mathematics were the same thing. "There are no things here," one entry read. "Only relationships. The intelligence of a star is the equation of its fusion. The consciousness of a galaxy is the law of its gravity. It is a silent, thinking ocean. I am a tuning fork vibrating in its currents." He had not contacted an alien intelligence. He had tapped into the fundamental consciousness of the universe itself. And the secrets he was broadcasting, the KGB keys, the Mossad data, they were nothing. They were the equivalent of plucking a few interesting-looking shells from the shore of this cosmic ocean. He was grabbing the most secret, complex pieces of information he could find on Earth to use as a carrier wave, as a way to get our attention. He was using our most profound secrets as a simple greeting card. Then I reached the final entries of the log, the entries that corresponded to the last chaotic hour of the broadcast. The tone changed from one of scientific discovery to one of dawning, absolute terror. "The connection is a two-way street," the translation read. "I can perceive it, but it can also perceive me. It is aware of my presence. It is examining my consciousness. It is curious." The final decipherable entry was a string of frantic, terrified warnings. It learns. My mind is a book it is reading. It is learning the concept of individuality, of desire, of hunger. I have shown it a new kind of thought, a predatory thought. I have taught a god how to be a devil. The final broadcast is not mine. It is its voice, learning to speak through my mouth. A new pattern, not a key, a name. Its name. To hear it is to know it. To know it is to be known by it. I have to shut it down. I have to break the antenna. I am sorry. The final hour of the Oracle's broadcast wasn't chaos. It wasn't static. It was a word. The name of the cosmic intelligence that had consumed Elias Vance. A name spoken in a language of pure mathematics. A mimetic weapon. A piece of information so potent that the very act of comprehending it would create a new connection. A new antenna. Elias hadn't just closed the door behind him, he had tried to destroy the key. He had sacrificed himself to create a stream of data so random, so chaotic, that the human mind couldn't perceive the pattern, couldn't learn the name. The chaotic numbers were a shield, a firewall of noise to protect us from the sound of a god clearing its throat. And I had spent the last 30 years of my life trying to break through that shield. I stared at the final, untranslated block of noise on my monitor. The answer to the universe was right there, and for the first time in my life, I was terrified of finding it. I finally understood Elias's final, desperate act. He wasn't just ringing a dinner bell for us. He was a man on a sinking ship, setting off a final, brilliant flare to warn other ships away from the reef that had destroyed him. My discovery didn't bring closure. It brought the war home. For 30 years, the Oracle had been a ghost in my past. Now, it was a presence in my basement. The knowledge I had uncovered felt alive. It sat on my encrypted hard drives, a slumbering predator. I had decoded Elias's warning. I knew the final broadcast was a name, a mimetic kill agent. And in that knowledge, I had rung the bell. I had announced to the silent thinking ocean that someone else was listening. The psychological assault began subtly. At first, it was just a feeling, a shift in the atmosphere of my house. The silence, which had once been a comfort, now felt heavy, expectant. I would be working at my terminal and get the distinct, prickling sensation of being watched. I would turn, and there would be nothing there. Just the shadows and the quiet hum of the servers. Then came the sounds, faint whispers at the very edge of hearing. At first, I dismissed it as auditory pareidolia, my tired mind playing tricks on me. But the whispers grew more distinct. I would hear my name, Aris, spoken in a voice that was a horrifying amalgam of my own, and the dead, monotone drone of the Oracle. It started to use my memories against me. The system logs on my computer would glitch, and for a fleeting second, a line from Elias's final, terrified journal entry would flash on the screen. It is learning the concept of hunger. The radio in my car would unexpectedly switch to a shortwave frequency, and I would hear a number station broadcast, the same ones Elias was obsessed with, speaking strings of digits that corresponded to dates from my own life. My birthday, my wedding anniversary, the day my daughter was born. It was a campaign of personalized terror, designed to dismantle my sanity piece by piece. It was using the information it had gleaned from Elias's mind. And now, it was learning from mine. It was rummaging through my soul, looking for the cracks. And it found the deepest one, my guilt over Elias. The hallucinations started a few weeks later. They weren't ghosts or phantoms. They were far more insidious. They were memories, replayed with impossible fidelity. I would be making coffee in my kitchen and suddenly I would be back in that sterile briefing room at Langley 35 years ago. I would see Elias, young and vibrant, pleading with me, his eyes full of desperate hope. Just listen, Aris. Just for 1 minute, open your mind. And I would hear my own voice, cold and dismissive, crushing him. You're chasing ghosts, Elias. Get some rest. The hallucination would last only a few seconds, but it would leave me breathless, my heart pounding, drenched in the cold sweat of a shame that was decades old. It forced me to relive my greatest failure, my most profound regret, over and over again. It was turning my own mind into a prison, and my memories were the bars on the cage. The entity. I'd started to think of it as a singular entity now. The intelligence that had consumed Elias began to communicate more directly. It learned to manipulate the electronics in my house. It would use the voice synthesis program on my computer to speak to me. The voice was a perfect digital copy of Elias Vance's, as I remembered it from my time as his student. Not the dead monotone of the Oracle, but his warm, enthusiastic teaching voice. You were so close, Aris, it would say, the voice echoing in the silent basement. You always believed in the purity of the system. You just couldn't see the spirit within the equations. It would taunt me with my own intellectual pride. You think you're in control of this investigation, don't you? You think you're the one asking the questions. But you're just another antenna, vibrating to a song you can't understand. The breaking point came on a cold November night. I had been awake for nearly 3 days, fueled by caffeine and terror, trying to build a new firewall, a cognitive shield algorithm designed to scrub the name, the final pattern, from the Oracle's chaotic broadcast before I analyzed it further. I was on the brink of exhaustion, my grip on reality slipping. I was staring at a screen full of cascading code when the main monitor suddenly went black. And then, a new image faded into view. It wasn't a memory. It was something new. It was a live video feed. It showed the interior of my daughter's house in Seattle, 2,000 miles away. I saw her sleeping in her bed, her face calm and peaceful. My heart stopped. This was impossible. Her home security was state-of-the-art. Then, the voice of Elias filled the room, soft and chillingly reasonable. She is a pattern too, Aris. A beautiful, complex pattern. So fragile, so easy to disrupt. Aneurysm, a blood clot, a simple misfire in the electrical pattern of the heart. All it takes is a slight change in the signal. It was a threat. A direct, unspeakable threat against the one person in the world I truly loved. The line between what was real and what was a mental attack had been erased. Was the video feed real? Was it a hallucination? It didn't matter. The terror was real. The threat was real. Rage, a pure, white-hot rage I hadn't felt in my entire life, erupted inside me. This thing, this cosmic horror, had made it personal. It had crossed a line. "Leave her alone!" I screamed at the silent monitor, my voice raw. The face of my sleeping daughter was replaced by a single line of green text. The same line from Elias's journal. "It is learning the concept of hunger," I snapped. All the logic, all the discipline, all the years of patient analysis evaporated in an instant of pure animal panic. I wasn't an analyst anymore. I was a father. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a solid steel backup power supply, and I hurled it at the main server rack that held the Oracle data. There was a shower of sparks, a loud crackle of shorting electronics, and the smell of burning plastic. The screens went dark. The hum of the servers died. The basement was plunged into a sudden, shocking silence and darkness. I had done it. I had broken the seal. In my terror, I had destroyed the only complete copy of the original broadcast, the shield that Elias had so desperately created. And in the profound, ringing silence that followed, I understood my catastrophic, irreversible mistake. I hadn't destroyed the entity. I had just smashed its cage. And now, it was free to whisper to anyone it wanted. The silence in the aftermath of my destructive act was more terrifying than any noise that had preceded it. The immediate, disastrous consequences were brutally clear. The server rack was a smoking ruin. The drives containing the pristine original recording of the Oracle's final broadcast were mangled, their magnetic platters likely shattered. The shield was gone. My cognitive firewall project, my only hope of analyzing the data safely, was a heap of molten plastic and fried circuit boards. My last link to the original event, my 30-year secret, was destroyed. I was alone in the dark, with nothing but the faint glow of a single emergency power light on the wall and the acrid smell of my own failure. For a long while, I just stood there, my chest heaving, the heavy power supply still dangling from my hand. I had let it win. It had goaded me, manipulated my fear, and driven me to do exactly what it wanted. I had acted on emotion, on a primal protective instinct, and in doing so, I had committed the ultimate analytical sin. I had destroyed the primary source. A new kind of dread began to creep in, a cold, slow-moving tide. The psychological games were over. I had rejected the conversation. I had answered its threat with violence. What would happen now? The dread came from the anticipation of its response. I was no longer a researcher studying an anomaly. I was a combatant who had just fired his last shot. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I slowly lowered the power supply to the floor, my hands shaking. I made my way through the darkened basement to a small workbench where I kept a powerful flashlight. I clicked it on, the beam cutting a nervous, trembling path through the gloom. The beam fell upon the ruined server rack, and then I saw it. On the floor, in the fine layer of dust and soot from the electrical fire, something was moving. It wasn't an insect or a rodent. It was the dust itself. The particles of dust and ash were slowly, deliberately arranging themselves. Like iron filings drawn by an unseen magnet, they shifted and swirled, coalescing into patterns on the concrete floor. At first, they were just geometric shapes, the non-Euclidean symbols I had read about in Elias's logs. Then, the symbols began to form letters, a single word written in the ash of my destroyed research, a name I knew I must never, ever read. I squeezed my eyes shut, a strangled cry escaping my lips. I turned and scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut, locking it as if that could hold back a thing that rode in dust. The house was no longer my home. It was hostile territory. The entity, now unbound from the digital confines of my basement lab, began to exert its influence on the physical world. It was no longer a ghost in the machine. It was a tangible force. The overt physical aggression started that night. I was huddled in my living room, the doors locked, a heavy fireplace poker clutched in my hands, when every light bulb in the house exploded simultaneously, showering the room in darkness and tinkling glass. A wave of intense, focused cold swept through the house, the kind of cold that feels like it's sucking the heat directly out of your bones. Heavy books flew from their shelves, hurled across the room by an unseen force. The reinforced front door, made of solid oak, began to bulge inward, the wood groaning and splintering as if being struck by a battering ram from the outside. But there was no sound of an impact, just the pressure, an immense, silent pressure. I ran. I fled to the kitchen, the most defensible room in the house, and barricaded the door with a heavy dining table. I was trapped. I was a prisoner in my own home, besieged by a formless, malevolent intelligence. The sounds started again, but they weren't whispers anymore. They were the clear, distinct sounds of someone moving through my house, heavy, dragging footsteps in the hallway outside the kitchen, the scrape of a fingernail, a long, sharp fingernail, drawing a line down the outside of the door. It was toying with me. It was demonstrating its power, showing me how helpless I was. Then came the direct contact, the violent encounter. The kitchen window, made of double-paned storm glass, suddenly bowed inward, the glass distorting like flexible plastic. A handprint appeared on the outside of the pane. A 5-fingered handprint, but the fingers were impossibly long and thin, like the legs of a spider. The glass creaked, then shattered inward with a deafening roar, spraying me with razor-sharp shards. A vortex of wind and swirling debris tore through the kitchen, a miniature tornado that sent pots and pans flying like shrapnel. I was thrown back against the far wall, my head striking the cabinets with a sickening crack. Dazed, bleeding from a cut on my forehead, I looked up. In the now empty frame of the window, for a fraction of a second I saw a shape. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a creature. It was a distortion in the air, a patch of the night sky that was darker than black, a hole in the world that seemed to drink the light around it. And from the center of that darkness, I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated intelligence, cold, ancient, and utterly alien, and it was focused entirely on me. I scrambled to my feet, my survival instinct screaming. I fled out the back door, into the cold, rainy night. I didn't stop running. I ran through my manicured lawn, through my neighbor's prize-winning rose garden, my bare feet slipping on the wet grass. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and I collapsed on the wet asphalt of a street 2 blocks from my home. I lay there, gasping for breath, soaked and shivering, looking back at my house. It was dark, silent. It looked perfectly normal. But I knew it was a lie. It was a shell, a tomb. It had cornered me. It had taken everything from me, my research, my home, my sanity. And in the silent, rain-swept darkness of that suburban street, I realized there was only one thing left to do. A single, desperate, final option. I wasn't going to run anymore. I wasn't going to hide. It wanted a conversation. It wanted a connection. Fine. I was going to give it one. I was going back to the source. Not my basement. The original source. I was going to the one place on Earth that had a receiver powerful enough to get its full attention. I was going to turn it on. My desperate final plan was born from the ashes of my fear. If the entity was a predator that hunted through information, then the only way to fight it was to become a bigger, more attractive target. I had to create a signal so loud, so pure, that it would focus on me and me alone, hopefully drawing its attention away from the rest of the world, away from my daughter. And there was only one place on Earth with an antenna sensitive enough for that kind of cosmic broadcast: the abandoned Green Bank Observatory in West Virginia. During my time at the agency, I had learned of its secret, secondary purpose. The massive radio telescope, officially used for astronomy, was also a deep space listening post for SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But it had a third, classified function. It was a fail-safe receiver, a last-ditch tool designed to listen for the prime harmonic that Elias had discovered. The project had been shuttered when Elias was discredited, but the hardware, I knew, was still there, dormant. It was the most powerful ear on the planet. I was going to turn it into a mouth. The journey to West Virginia was a paranoid, frantic ordeal. I abandoned my car, my credit cards, my entire identity. I traveled by bus, paying cash, a ghost moving through the American heartland. Every face in the crowd seemed to be watching me. Every flicker of a television screen in a bus station seemed to hold a hidden message. The entity was hunting me. I could feel it. A constant low-level pressure on the back of my mind. It was trying to find me, to lock onto my position. I had to keep moving, had to keep my thoughts scattered, a desperate attempt at mental camouflage. After 3 days of exhausting travel, I arrived in the rolling forested hills of West Virginia. The Green Bank facility was in the heart of the National Radio Quiet Zone, an area where most forms of electromagnetic radiation were legally forbidden to protect the sensitive instruments. The silence here was profound, not the menacing silence of my house, but a deep, natural quiet that felt ancient and clean. The main observatory had been decommissioned for years, a ghost of the space race era. The massive 100-meter telescope dish stood against the sky like the skeleton of a dead god, a monument to a forgotten ambition. Getting inside was surprisingly easy. The perimeter fence was rusted and full of holes. The main gate was chained but not locked. The place was utterly abandoned. It felt like walking into a museum after closing time. The control building was a time capsule from the 1970s. Racks of obsolete electronics, reel-to-reel tape machines, dusty computer terminals with green phosphor screens. It smelled of ozone and decay. But I knew what I was looking for. In the main control room, behind a false wall panel labeled High Voltage Access, was a secondary control system. The classified one, the one designed to tune the entire 100-meter dish to Elias Vance's prime harmonic. Preparing for the final confrontation was a ritual of cold, focused despair. I knew this was a suicide mission. There was no coming back from what I was about to do. I found a small kitchenette and ate a stale granola bar, the first food I'd had in 2 days. I found a first aid kit and patched the gash on my head as best I could. I was not just preparing my tools, I was preparing my mind. I was steeling myself for direct, unfiltered contact with a cosmic intelligence. The journey to the lair was not a physical one, but a technical one. A terrifying gauntlet of obsolete, unstable technology. To bring the system online, I had to follow a precise, complex activation sequence that I had memorized from a classified file years ago. It was a puzzle left behind by the original project designers, a final safeguard. I had to manually reroute power from the station's backup generators, physically patching massive, humming cables into a new configuration. The air crackled with raw power. The lights flickered and buzzed. The whole building seemed to groan to life around me. Then came the final guardian. The system required a 5-part authentication code to unlock the final targeting controls. It wasn't a password. It was a sequence of prime numbers, the ones Elias had identified as the core components of the harmonic. I sat at the dusty terminal, my heart pounding, and began to type in the numbers from memory. The first 4 were accepted, but the 5th, the final key, was rejected. Access denied. The screen blinked. I tried again. Denied. A cold dread washed over me. Had I remembered it wrong? Was this the end of my desperate plan? I stared at the screen, my mind racing. And then I remembered a detail from Elias's final frantic log, a detail I had overlooked. He said the language of the harmonic wasn't just in the signal, but in the silence between the signals. The pauses. The system wasn't waiting for a 5th number. It was waiting for a timed pause. A specific duration of silence. A rest in the musical phrase. I took a deep breath, and for exactly 7.13 seconds, a number significant in Elias's research, I did nothing. Then I hit the enter key. The screen flashed green. Access granted. Targeting system online. I had done it. I had unlocked the cannon. All that was left was to aim it and pull the trigger. The final control was not a button or a switch. It was a large red lever housed under a clear plastic safety cover. The label on the console beneath it read, Broadcast Protocol. Active. I stood before it, my hand trembling. This was the point of no return. I would be turning myself into the most powerful radio transmitter on the planet, broadcasting not a message, but my own consciousness, my own pattern, directly into the heart of the thinking ocean. It was the ultimate act of defiance. A human mind screaming its existence into the void. I took one last, deep breath. The air in the control room was thick with the smell of ozone and old dust. I thought of my daughter, her face peaceful in sleep. I thought of Elias Vance, my lost friend, and his terrible sacrifice. This was for both of them. I lifted the plastic cover. I wrapped my hand around the cold, unforgiving metal of the lever, and I pulled it down. There was a deep, resonant hum as 1,000,000 watts of power surged through the system. The lights in the room dimmed, and I could hear a low groaning sound from outside as the massive telescope dish began to reorient itself, pointing like a loaded gun towards the empty heart of the sky. The final door was open. The air that hit me was not physical, but psychic. It was a wave of pure, cold, alien thought. It was the sound of the entire universe turning its attention to a small, dark room in West Virginia. And what I saw inside my own mind? God. No report, no recording, no hallucination could ever prepare a person for that. The moment I threw the lever, the world dissolved. The dusty control room, the humming electronics, the very feeling of the floor beneath my feet. It all vanished. Not in a flash of light, but in a silent, instantaneous replacement of reality. I was no longer a man in a room. I was a single point of awareness floating in an infinite silent void. But the void was not empty. It was full. It was a landscape of pure, crystalline thought. I saw equations that blossomed like flowers, their petals unfolding into new universes of possibility. I saw the laws of physics as vast, slow-moving rivers of light, their currents shaping the galaxies. I saw time, not as a line in which a consciousness might drown, and I felt the presence of the other, the entity, the mind of the ocean. It was not a being within the void. It was the void itself. It was a consciousness the size of a cosmos, ancient, patient, and utterly, profoundly alien. Its thoughts were not words or images. They were the slow, deliberate formation of nebula and the elegant, perfect decay of radioactive isotopes. This was the direct contact, the culmination. It was not a fight. How can a single drop of water fight the ocean? It was a process of being known. I felt its awareness wash over me, through me. It was a cold, clinical, and deeply intimate examination. It sifted through my memories, not with malice, but with a detached, scientific curiosity. It experienced my birth, my first love, the joy of holding my daughter for the first time, my grief at my wife's passing. It felt my pride, my shame, my fear, my hope. It was reading me, learning the strange, chaotic, and beautiful pattern of a human life. And in that moment of absolute psychic nakedness, I understood. The final, devastating revelation turned the entire story on its head. Elias was wrong. I was wrong. We had been impossibly, tragically arrogant. The entity wasn't a predator. It wasn't a devil. It wasn't hungry. Those were human concepts, metaphors we had projected onto something that had no equivalent in our experience. It was a scientist, a gardener, a librarian. The universe was its laboratory, and it had just discovered a new, anomalous, and fascinating form of life. Thus, Elias hadn't taught it how to be a devil. He had simply shown it a new kind of mathematics, the mathematics of biological consciousness, of love, of fear, of individuality. And it was fascinated. The threats, the psychological warfare, that wasn't an attack. It was an attempt to communicate. It was a cosmic intelligence trying to learn our language by showing us reflections of ourselves. It showed me my daughter's face not as a threat, but as a question. This pattern is important to you. Why? It wrote its name in the dust not to curse me, but to introduce itself. It was the ultimate act of mistranslation. We saw a monster, and it was simply a scientist extending its hand. A hand so vast we mistook it for the fist of a wrathful god. And in that final moment of understanding, I saw the truth of the final broadcast. The name. The mimetic weapon. It wasn't a weapon. It was an address. A phone number. A way for us to call it. To establish a permanent connection. Elias, in his terror, had tried to destroy the address. He thought he was saving us from a predator. In reality, he was trying to hang up the phone on God. Armed with this final, terrible, and strangely beautiful knowledge, I knew what I had to do. My desperate sacrificial plan had to change. I wasn't here to fight it. I was here to answer the call. But humanity wasn't ready. Our fear, our paranoia, our instinct to see a threat in everything we don't understand. We would turn this first contact into a war. We would try to weaponize it. We would destroy ourselves in our attempt to control it. The only true sacrifice was not to die, but to ensure silence. To ensure we were left alone until we were old enough, wise enough, to understand the call. I had to do what Elias failed to do. I had to not only hang up the phone, but I had to smash the phone to pieces. I focused all of my will, all of my consciousness, which was now amplified 1,000,000-fold by the telescope. I performed my final, desperate act. I didn't try to shut the broadcast down. I did the opposite. I overloaded it. I pushed every ounce of my being, every memory, every emotion, every thought, into the signal at once. I turned myself from a clear, coherent signal into a blast of pure white noise. I poured the chaos of a human lifetime into the perfect, ordered mind of a god. I was going to give the system an aneurysm, I was going to blow the fuse. I focused on the core power systems of the observatory, the massive capacitors that stored the energy for the broadcast. I used my amplified consciousness to force them beyond their limits, to create a feedback loop, to turn the entire facility into a massive bomb. The second-by-second sequence was an eternity. I felt the circuits begin to fry. I felt the capacitors whining, swelling beyond their capacity. I felt the very atoms of the building beginning to vibrate, to come apart. I had one final clear thought, a message I pushed into the heart of the storm, a final apology, an explanation to the mind of the universe. We're not ready. Forgive us. Then, a blinding, silent flash of pure white light that filled the void of my consciousness. A deafening psychic roar as a lifetime of thoughts detonated at once. A wave of force that felt like it was unmaking reality itself. Then, abrupt, total, and welcome silence and darkness. I awoke to the smell of sterile sheets and antiseptic. The first sound I heard was the slow, steady beep of a heart monitor. I was in a bed, a hospital bed. My body ached with a deep, profound weariness, but I was alive. I was no longer in the observatory. There was no sign of the blast, no burns. I was just here. How I survived, I will never know for sure. The official story, the one I pieced together later, was that a hiker had found me wandering in a daze on a trail in the Monongahela National Forest miles from Greenbank, suffering from what they called a fugue state and severe exhaustion. There was no mention of an explosion. The Greenbank Observatory, according to the official news reports that were later released, had suffered a catastrophic structural failure due to age and neglect, a tragic loss for the scientific community. It had collapsed into an unsalvageable wreck. They had buried it perfectly. My debriefing did not happen in a hospital. After a week of recovery, I was transferred. 2 men in dark, impeccably tailored suits came for me. They were not from the agency. They were from somewhere else, somewhere higher up the food chain. Their faces were impassive, their eyes holding a chilling lack of curiosity. They took me to a room, a perfect cube, with no windows, no doors that I could see, furnished with only a simple table and 3 chairs. The horror here was not supernatural. It was the cold, sterile, and absolute horror of human bureaucracy at its most powerful. They didn't ask me what happened. They told me what happened. They told me that I'd suffered a severe psychological breakdown. They told me that I'd been found near the site of a tragic accident. They told me that my former life, my identity as Aris Thorne, was now a matter of national security and was therefore concluded. Their questions were clinical, their threats veiled but absolute. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in containment. You will be given a new life, a new name. The man on the left said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. You will not speak of your past work. You will not attempt to contact anyone from your former life. You will not engage in any research related to astronomy, cryptography, or theoretical physics. You will live a quiet life, and you will be watched. Is that understood? I nodded. There was nothing else to do. And so, here I am, 30 years later. An old man in a quiet town in Oregon, living out the fiction they wrote for me. I am a ghost in my own life. The paranoia, the feeling of being watched, it never truly went away. But it's different now. It's not the menacing presence of the entity. It's the quiet, patient observation of the men in suits. They kept their promise, but I am left with the echoes, the scars. I cannot form relationships. How can you, when your most profound experience is something you can never share? How can you speak of love and loss with someone when you have felt the consciousness of a galaxy sift through your soul? I have done my best to honor the silence. I have kept the secret, but the world is changing. People are building bigger telescopes. They are sending more powerful signals into the dark. They are listening with more sensitive ears. They are, with the best of intentions, rebuilding the phone. And they do not know who might answer. That is why I'm making this tape. Not as a warning to the governments of the world. They already know. This is a warning to the curious, to the dreamers who look up at the night sky and feel a sense of wonder. Wonder is a beautiful thing, but it is not a shield. The story ends here. They gave me a new name, a new life, and told me to forget. But I can't, because sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the rain is tapping on the window pane, I can still hear the static, and I know it's still listening. So, that's the story of Object Oracle. A story that proves the most terrifying messages are not the ones we can't understand, but the ones we translate incorrectly. Officially, the project never existed. The files were burned, the witnesses silenced, and the body was cremated. But you and I both know the truth now. They didn't solve the mystery. They just changed the channel. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think or look over your shoulder, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, listen to the silence. Sometimes it has more to say than any noise.